was sanctioned by the Prime Minister before dispatch. So here's a situation in which the Honourable Member probably saying maybe the Prime Minister didn't give him any authority. Claims. Letter continues, Madam Speaker. Sir David graciously supplied me with a copy for my information. I should be obliged to receive your comments and opinion on these transactions in light of your recent pronouncement that the government of Antigua and Barbuda accepted the Don Mitchell QC report, which recommends that the amateurish way in which I had conducted negotiations in the past should be discontinued. Your views and opinion on these matters would be appreciated. Now, Madam Speaker, the learned Attorney General would not have reduced his response to writing, but I have no doubt that, having been asked of his opinion, that he would have indicated to the Honourable Member for St. Philip South that clearly there were a number of procedural breaches. There's no doubt about it, Madam Speaker. And whereas some may want to argue that these breaches were done in the interest of time, the bottom line is the government had more than sufficient time to ready itself for the CWC preparations. Because even as members of the opposition, we came here 2 years before the event and placed questions to the relevant ministers about the country's preparation. So one would have expected that that in itself would have urged the government into some form of action at that time. So for them to have waited last minute and say that they didn't have any time, perhaps to go to tender and so on, so they had to negotiate with C.O. Williams on a bilateral basis, I want to say here that that is certainly unacceptable. And I hope when the members on the other side speak, that the relevant minister or ministers would indicate why is it that we did not have sufficient time to ensure that this particular process went through the normal route of public tendering. And I want to emphasize public tendering in opposed to selected tendering, in which they basically manage the process and give it to the person who they so, or group or firm who they so desire. Anyway, Madam Speaker, I'm sure that you would agree with me that having gotten those correspondences in which the Honourable Member for St. Philip South was extremely concerned, and I wouldn't say what things were said off the record, but the Honourable Member clearly from these letters was very, very concerned about the whole process of awarding the contract to C.O. Williams. Now, as members of the opposition, Madam Speaker, we have a responsibility, a duty to ensure that there's good governance in this country. We have to police the state resources to make sure they're not extorted in any way. In fact, we are the ones who have the primary responsibility to ensure that there are proper checks and balances within the system, ensure that they don't vacuum the treasury. So if the Honourable Member for St. Philip South at that time was so moved, you can imagine, Madam Speaker, on our side, we were even more concerned. Now, Madam Speaker, as I said to you, questions were actually put to various ministers on the other side, and they were conflicting in nature. So we then recognized that there's a problem. We then sought to get certain information, further details, further particulars from certain agencies of the government. We wrote to the Tenders Board, Madam Speaker. I personally wrote to the Tenders Board on 2 occasions. I've also had discussions with the chairperson of the Tenders Board, Ms. Lee. And up to date, Madam Speaker, the information that we requested certain information. Information covering the contracts that were awarded, the information as to whether or not they went through the tender process, and if so, what form of tendering, if it was selective or open tendering. We asked for information to include the scope of works, the bill of quantities, and, Madam Speaker, up to this day, we have not gotten information. In fact, at one point, Ms. Lee wrote back and said that the Tenders Board was unable to meet, and that when they next meet, they will give consideration to it. A one-liner. Total disrespect. And, Madam Speaker, the information that was sought was actually sought under the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in this Honourable House under the UPP. You know, they have bragged time and time again about the trilogy of legislation. But, as they say, the true proof of the pudding is in the eating. But having tested that particular piece of legislation, Madam Speaker, on several occasions, we are not satisfied that there is a proper system in place to provide for the access of information by the public. And that too itself is one of the failings within the system. That is one of the things that this resolution, as you may recognize, Madam Speaker, is asking the government to correct. We also wrote to the LOC, the Local Organizing Committee, and asked for a report as to how the 12 million that was transferred to them, how that was spent. And Madam Speaker, we have not even had an acknowledgement of our request. I met personally with the Freedom of Information Commissioner and sought her intervention because, as you may be aware, Madam Speaker, the Freedom of Information Act mandates that the information be provided within 20 working days. And this request was made since last year, May. There was another request that was made in January of this year. Not only to the two agencies, but also to the Freedom of Information Commissioner, explaining our frustration in getting the necessary information and asking for her intervention. Madam Speaker, after the second occasion in January, when we wrote to her, I personally went to her office. I have to tell you, after 10 she wasn't there. Anyway, I waited. And I met with her, asked for intervention, and she gave me some bogus reason why she can't do it. How there are certain weaknesses in the law. The law is not very specific as to what information can be given. All sorts of nonsense, Madam Speaker. However, I said to her, notwithstanding that, we require you to test the system. Could you kindly write to the various agencies and ask them to provide information? And Madam Speaker, up to this day, nothing has been done. So that when we speak to the governance framework that needs to be in place, this is one of the areas that we're saying that needs to be strengthened in order to have good governance in this country. It is not sufficient to pass a piece of legislation, have it dangling, have a few token officers in place, and at the same time, the particular piece of legislation is not operational in terms of its effect in getting information to the public. And I hope that the Honourable Member for St. John's Rural West is listening, because he's one of the members that love to brag about the trilogy of legislation. You've got to look at its operationalization, whether or not it is working, if people are getting information under that particular regime. And I want to put it to the Honourable Member and his government that the Freedom of Information Act is not working. Now, Madam Speaker, you'll recognize that several attempts to get information from the government was actually dealt with either in a frivolous way or there were no response. Which meant, therefore, we had to elevate the situation. And it got to the stage where we decided to protest. Because here's a situation in which we got conflicting reports, Madam Speaker, evidencing that, for sure, there's something wrong in terms of the figures. And in addition to that, we were in possession of these letters written by the member for St. Philip South, indicating that something was wrong. And clearly, we had already established from the onset that there were some procedural breaches. Now, Madam Speaker, having taken to the streets to get the attention of the government, what did they do? They treated us with scant regard. And perhaps they saw it as an exclusively partisan issue. But, Madam Speaker, it was not. In fact, I know at one point an attempt was made to quell the issue. And the Director of Public Works was actually asked to address the issue, Mr. Barry Davis. And he did. But, Madam Speaker, having listened and having read his report, we recognize that it was a cover-up. Because in that very report, the Director of Public Works indicated that he himself was not an integral part of that project. And as I indicated earlier, the Ministry of Public Works was not integrally involved. Yes, they had an engineer by the name of, I don't know if it's Cheyenne,